Grace stands by the sink, gripping the edge of the counter. Her light blue sweater is slightly wrinkled, her hands trembling as she stares at the pie on the counter. Behind her, Mark looms in the doorway, his voice low and cold. "I don't know why you thought inviting Helen over was a good idea, Grace." Grace turns slowly, her face pale yet composed. She wasn't invited. She just dropped off a pie. "And that coffee invite, that wasn't just a drop-off, was it, Grace?" Mark's words dripping sarcasm. He leans in and whispers, "Do you think people don't notice, Grace? That they don't talk?" Grace exhales. Her gaze drops to the floor. The sound of her front door slamming shut echoes in her memory. Helen walking down the garden path, waving behind her as Mark's glare sears through Grace, with Helen's hot, fragrant pie between them. She lifts her chin slightly, meeting Mark's cold gaze, replying calmly, "Not everything is about you, Mark." Mark enters the kitchen. "How's it coming along?" Grace glances up at him briefly, her hands busy chopping the vegetables methodically. Grace, tight-lipped, "Fine, everything will be ready on time." Mark steps over to the coffee machine, makes himself a cappuccino. He turns and watches Grace closely as he takes a sip. "Remember, my parents prefer the cranberry sauce chilled. Did you make it from scratch?" Grace nods, her jaw tightening. Mark moves towards Grace casually. "And Grace, about your sister Lucy. Let's keep things peaceful, okay?" Grace stops chopping for a moment, her knuckles white with tension, before resuming her work. "Peaceful. Right." Mark's faint smile disappears as he places his coffee cup in the sink and walks out of the kitchen. The front door swings open, and Grace's son Ethan steps inside, holding a bouquet of flowers. Tall and warm-natured, Ethan exudes an easy charm. Behind him is Grace's daughter, Emily, carrying a bakery box. Emily is sharp-eyed and confident, with a quick wit that often unsettles Mark. Grace's face lights up as she sees them. Grace, beaming. "Ethan! Emily! You're here!" She pulls them into a tight hug, holding on just a moment longer than usual. Mark approaches from the living room, his smile polite yet guarded. "Ethan, Emily, right on time," Mark says formally. Ethan, smiling cheerfully, hands over the flowers to Grace. "Hey, Mom, thought these might brighten up the table a bit." Emily holds up her box of pastries towards Grace, and with a big smile on her face says, "And I brought dessert, Mum. Real pumpkin pie, none of that canned stuff Aunt Lucy keeps bragging on about." Grace laughs, a rare moment of lightness, but it fades as Mark steps closer. "That's thoughtful, Emily, though Grace already made pie. It's always good to have extra, I suppose." Emily raises an eyebrow, her voice playful, but edged with meaning. "Well, I figured we could use a backup, just in case." Grace glances between them, sensing the tension. Ethan, ever the peacemaker, steps forward with an easy grin and says jokingly, "Pie fights are only fun in cartoons, people. Let's keep the gloves up." Moments later, the doorbell rings again. Mark opens the door and greets his parents. Mark's mother, beaming, "Oh, Mark, there's our golden boy." She swoops in, embracing him warmly while handing Grace a bottle of sparkling cider. "Grace, dear, how are you holding up?" "Hosting can be so stressful," Grace replies with forced politeness. "I'm managing, thank you." Grace's mother-in-law grabs her hand and pats it condescendingly. "I don't know how you keep up with Mark's standards. You must be exhausted." Mark, laughing, Now, mother. Grace knows I only ask for the best because I know she can do it." Grace squeezes her lips tight shut. The front door swings open, revealing Lucy holding a pie and a bottle of wine. She's impeccably dressed and wearing what looks like a very expensive new coat. "Grace! Oh my goodness, it smells incredible in here." She steps inside, looking around with a smile that carries just a hint of judgment. Grace takes the pie and wine, her smile strained. "Thanks, Lucy." Lucy glances toward the living room, where Mark's parents are chatting softly. She leans closer to Grace, lowering her voice. "You've really outdone yourself this year. I mean, it's not quite like how Mum does it, but still, good effort." Grace's smile falters as she goes into the kitchen and sets Lucy's pie and bottle of wine on the kitchen counter. Lucy follows, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "I know timing can be so tricky with a big meal like this," says Lucy, exuding fake concern. "Is the turkey done? It can dry out so quickly if you're not careful. "20 minutes later, Grace and Lucy's parents arrive. Her mother, elegantly dressed with a pearl necklace, steps inside, looking around the house with a critical eye. Her father, in a blazer and tie, stands stiffly, carrying a box of chocolates. Mark appears from the living room. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, welcome," Grace's father, shaking Mark's hand. "Mark, good to see you. Everything looks very modern," Grace's mother, smiling thinly. "Yes, very modern. Grace, dear, you've done your best, I see." Grace steps forward and takes the chocolates from her father, her smile slightly strained. "It's good to see you, Mum. Dad." Grace's mother glances towards Lucy, who is chatting with Mark's parents. "Lucy's already here, I see. Of course she is. She's ever so punctual, that one." Grace's father chuckles. "That's our Lucy, always on top of things." Grace clenches her jaw as she ushers her parents into the dining room. The dining room is warm and inviting, illuminated by a soft chandelier glow. The table is set to perfection, sparkling glasses, polished silverware, and plates half filled with the remnants of a hearty meal. Grace's pumpkin pie sits in the centre of the table, sliced, yet untouched. Lucy's perfectly wrapped pie sits off to the side, its pristine presentation screaming its silent challenge. Lucy, tilting her head with an amused smile. "Pumpkin pie. Classic choice, Grace. Did you use fresh pumpkin this time, or is it canned again?" Grace's hand pauses over her wineglass. She forces a smile, but her fingers tighten slightly around the stem. Grace, evenly, with forced lightness. "It's the same recipe I've always used." Lucy leans forward, inspecting the pie with exaggerated curiosity. Of course. It's just that fresh pumpkin makes such a difference. But I'm sure it's delicious." The table falls silent. Grace glances at Mark, who smirks faintly but says nothing. Across the table, Emily sets her wineglass down firmly, her eyes narrowing. "Delicious," quips Emily. "That's one way to put it. Maybe you can teach us how to make the perfect pie next year, Aunt Lucy. You know, since your pie is so perfect." Ethan chuckles under his breath, but Mark's gaze shifts sharply to Emily. He clears his throat, his voice calm but commanding. "Let's keep it civil. It's Thanksgiving in this house, not one of your debates." Grace flinches slightly at his tone. Her eyes flick to Emily, whose jaw tightens. Grace can feel the tension thickening, the weight of everyone's eyes on her. "You probably think you know what's happening here, but trust me, it's not as simple as it seems. If I speak up now, then Mark will shut me down in front of everyone. But if I stay quiet, then my sister Lucy gets away with it, again. And Emily's watching, she's always watching. If she sees me back down, then what will she think of me?" Grace clears her throat, her voice quiet yet firm. "It's fine, Emily. Lucy was just trying to help." Emily's head snaps toward her mother, her expression incredulous. Emily, shaking her head. "Help! She wasn't helping, Mum, she was—" Mark cuts in sharply. "Emily." His voice slices through the atmosphere like a blade. Emily glares at him, then leans back in her chair, crossing her arms. Grace swallows hard. Her gaze drops to her plate, while Lucy smirks in delight. Grace's hand trembles as she reaches for her wineglass. Ethan, ever the peacemaker, catches her eye and offers a warm smile, trying to steady her nerves and diffuse the tension. At this point, I don't care what it tastes like, or if it's tinned or fresh. Just pass the whipped cream. The table chuckles softly, tension eased. Grace offers Ethan a grateful smile, yet her shoulders remain a little tense. As dessert plates are distributed around the table, Grace recalls Helen's untouched pie on the kitchen counter, her thoughts suddenly far away. The kitchen is dimly lit by the warm glow of the overhead stove light. The living room chatter fades into the background as Grace stands alone. On the counter, Helen's pie sits untouched, still wrapped in its pristine foil. It's the last thing left on the counter, besides Lucy's bottle of red wine and Dad's box of chocolates. Grace wipes her hands on a dish towel, her movements slow and deliberate. Her gaze lands on Helen's pie. She stops mid-motion, the towel forgotten in her hands. Her shoulders slump slightly as she stares at it. It's just a pie. That's what I told him, but it's not, is it? It's not just a pie. She steps closer to the counter, her fingers brushing gently over the smooth foil. Why didn't I serve Helen's pumpkin pie instead of mine? She went out of her way to make it for me, for us. Her voice catches slightly as she pulls her hand back as though the pie has burned her. If I'd served it, Mark would have twisted it into a betrayal, just another excuse to remind me how wrong I am. And Lucy? She'd have laughed, said it was overdone or too sweet, but Helen doesn't see the world like that. She was just being kind. Kindness. I used to believe it was simple, even free, but in this house, kindness costs you everything. Helen doesn't see it that way, though. She doesn't play games or keep score. That pie, it was just a gesture. Just kind. She exhales softly, her fingers brushing the foil of the pie as if testing the edges of her own courage. A flicker of warmth crosses her face before, Grace, are you coming, or do I need to do everything myself? His voice crashes through her thoughts like a sudden clap of thunder. She flinches. Her hand jerks away from the pie as though caught in the act of something forbidden. Her chest tightens, and her breath hitches for a moment. She straightens quickly, smooths her sweater, her face flushed as if exposed. Grace, where are you? Booms Mark. Suddenly Mark appears in the doorway, scanning the room. Without a word, he steps into the kitchen and leans casually against the counter beside her. Ah, I thought I'd find you in here. Kitchen all clean, I see. Good. He follows her gaze to the pumpkin pie sitting untouched on the counter, and for a brief moment, the room falls silent. Still sitting here, I see. Grace's hands rest on the counter in front of the pie. It's just a pie, Mark. Mark's voice tightens. You think it's just a pie, but it's not, Grace. It's not about the pie. It's about what it means. Grace slowly sets Helen's pumpkin pie to the side, her movements careful and deliberate. She wipes her hands on the towel, keeping her gaze firmly on the counter. Avoiding Mark's piercing, accusing eyes, she busies herself around the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she pretends to tidy up. What does it mean, Mark? Mark steps closer, his voice low yet cutting, the tension between them palpable. It means you let her in. You let her think she's welcome here, in my house. And that's how it starts. First, it's a pie. Then it's coffee. Then it's her meddling in things that don't concern her. Grace turns to face him, her expression carefully neutral. Her hands clutch the towel tightly, and her voice, though soft, carries a sharp edge. Helen was just being kind, Mark, that's all. Kind! Spits Mark. Kindness comes at a cost, Grace. You think people like her do things out of the goodness of their hearts? No, Grace. They do it to intrude, to take over, and you let them, you always let them. Grace's jaw tightens as she stays rooted in place, towel crumpled between her delicate fingers. Grace, quietly but firmly. Not everyone's trying to take over, Mark. Not everyone's you. Mark freezes, tension crackles in the silence. His eyes narrow as he takes a slow step back. Expression remains cold. Mark, low and deliberate. Be careful, Grace. You're walking on very thin ice. His words linger in the air like a thick fog. Grace exhales slowly. Her hands relax their grip on the towel. She looks him straight in the eye, her gaze steady, her voice calm yet steadfast. Well, maybe I'm tired of walking on thin ice. Mark's lips press into a thin line, his jaw tightens. He straightens his posture, towering over her, yet Grace doesn't flinch. He turns abruptly, his footsteps heavy as he walks out the kitchen and into the living room. Grace exhales sharply and looks back at Helen's pie, her gaze lingering. Slowly she unwraps it, her hands steady but deliberate, as though handling something fragile. Picking up a cake knife, she slices a small piece and places it gently on a dessert plate. With quiet resolve, she carries the plate to the small kitchen table and sits down, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Grace's family gathering brought tensions and pain she could have done well without. Think she stood up for herself enough? What would have you done in Grace's place? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you missed any of the previous episodes of Behind Closed Doors, here's episode 1 and 2 to get you started. See you in the next video.